as long as they had this financing model, there was really no limit to what people would pay.
Is college worth it today? 56% of Americans say no, it's not. And that's remarkable. To understand how we got here and how to think about attending and paying for college, I've asked economist Gary Shilling to join us. I'm Ed D'Agostino from Malden Economics, and this is Global Macro Update. Gary, I really appreciate you joining me. It's always great to see you. You just released your latest edition of Gary Shilling Insight, and it was all about college expense and paying for college and who wins and who loses. And I just thought it was, it's an area of great stress for a lot of people. Outside of buying a house, it's the biggest expenditure for a lot of parents in their lifetimes. And if you have more than one kid, you're now multiplying that times $200,000-$300,000 each. How should you think about going to college? What are the different decision points that you have to make?
Well, this was the main feature in our June monthly Insight publication, and the title was "Hoisted on Their Own Petards." It really referred to the dilemma that colleges have gotten themselves into because of their financing model. The way they do it, economists call this price discrimination. They're selling the same product in different markets at different prices. Now, by that I mean they sell the college education, the full boat, all the fees, the full charges to the wealthy. And they can afford it. They don't care. It doesn't really strain them. Then they use a lot of that money to subsidize poorer students, and they get the student body they mix that they want. Okay, so far so good. But the problem is all the people in the middle, the people who are neither rich enough that it's no big strain or poor enough that they get pretty much a free ride. And those are the people that are really in trouble. And are reacting, and we're seeing tremendous changes as a result. We're seeing, interestingly, recent Wall Street Journal poll where 53% of Americans don't think college is worth it. Now that is a huge change when you look about it. The Europeans came to this country very lusting for education. They were getting away from rigid class structures in Europe, and they saw education as the way to advance. And it was really, even if you go back before the Constitution, the Northwest Ordinances in the Articles of Confederation set aside education property to be sold for education in what are now the states of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, etc. So it's a long tradition. But what's happened now with this cost, people will simply say it isn't worth it. So what are they doing? They are emphasizing other things. One of them is apprenticeship programs, which are interesting because the Germans traditionally have a very strong apprenticeship program approach to life. Even bakers have to be apprenticed in Germany. But when German manufacturers came to the Southeast in this country, auto plants and so on, they brought that program with them. And American companies have picked that up, and they have these apprenticeship programs combined with 2-year community college degrees, and these people are starting at $80,000, $90,000 a year. And they're really saying, why should I take time out 4 years and the cost, $100,000 a year or close to it, and the time out of the workforce when I can be in an apprenticeship program and get paid while I learn. So people have a very different approach to this, and of course it really has de-emphasized the classical education. I mean, when I was in college back in the antediluvian era, and this was in Amherst College in Massachusetts, there was a big debate among professors between classical education, training the mind, critical thinking is the buzzword now, and preparation for jobs. And now it's basically preparation for jobs. It's STEM. That's the approach of most education. It isn't the classical education. It's not the follow on from the academy in ancient Greece and that whole idea of training the mind. It's preparation for jobs. And people are saying, hey, if I'm gonna spend that money, I want to make sure I'm going to get a reward for it, and that means a training for a job that's going to be well paid. So it has really turned education upside down, and of course, many colleges are really lost in the shuffle. You've had a tremendous closing of colleges. They're simply going out of business. Now, a lot of them were these for-profit operations, these glorified trade schools that had horrendous graduation records and were really they were just feasting off of government subsidies. They really were not very, very ethical to start with, in my view. But you've also had a lot of smaller, weaker colleges that have disappeared, consolidated, merged, and we're really changing the education system tremendously.
So, Gary, when you went to school and when I went to school, there was a variable that wasn't there, right? When you think about, is college worth it? We didn't have to plug in coming out with or paying $50,000 to $75,000 a year and potentially coming out with well into the six figures in debt. That just, I graduated with $7,500 in student loans. I entered from a relatively poor family, so I was kind of on that lower end, and I I got a lot of grants. So I benefited from kind of what you say, the lower end being subsidized to some extent, but something's changed. Can you talk a little bit about what drove this just massive ramp up in costs and prices at colleges?
Well, it was a college services arms race to a certain extent, because with this financing model that I described earlier, this price discrimination, there was the ability to collect tremendous fees and tuition payments from the wealthy, and also from the alumni and from foundations and so on and so forth. And so you had a service arms race. I mean, when I went to college, the dining hall, you got steel trays with indentations, and you went through the cafeteria, slop, you got this, slop, you got that, slop, you got that, and you went out and sat down. Now the food stations, all the things you want, all the ice cream, I love ice cream, all the stuff you want. I mean, and the services, the counseling, the deans, the provosts, the sub-deans, all those kinds of, that all came in because the money was there. And of course it became a vicious circle, because once people were paying all these high fees, they said, hey, wait a minute, why shouldn't I get these services? Why shouldn't little Louie or little Louise get the absolute best in terms of counseling and so on? Hey, when I was at Amherst College, and that was even then considered a very prestigious institution, and there was no counseling. You picked out your courses on your own, absolutely nothing. And in terms of where you went from there, I mean, I went into a PhD program at Stanford in economics. That was entirely nobody said anything. Now you have all these other services. So in other words, the money was there, so you had the services. The services are there, so people say, I better get them, and that means more money. And it just becomes a spiral. And as long as they had this financing model, where it was the guys on the top who were paying, plus the alumni and grants and so on, and they could subsidize the poor students and get the mix they wanted. Let's say the term in economics is price discrimination. You're selling the same product in different markets at different prices. As long as they could do that, and you didn't have this people in the middle who were getting squeezed and really squawked, there's no limit to what you could do. Somebody would pay $1 million to get their kids into Harvard. Hey, look what happened with Varsity Blues. Look at the amount of money that was paid. Not only were these parents paying the top dollar at Georgetown, Stanford, what have you, but they were paying this guy Rick. What was his name? Rick. They're paying him tens of thousands of dollars on top of that, and cheating and so on. Rick Singer. All this nonsense on top of that. So people, there was really no limit to what people would pay, and colleges on the other end But the Achilles heel was the middle class, the people who were neither too so rich that they didn't worry about the payments, or so poor that they got fully subsidized. The guys in the middle are the ones that tripped them up. That was their Achilles heel.
Yeah, and it feels like we're at a breaking point with that. I mean, we see it now with the argument, and I don't necessarily want to take sides because I can see both sides, but you have young adults out there, and even not so young adults, or people in their 40s that are still struggling to pay their student loans back, and there was an attempt to maybe wipe out a portion of that, and there was a big fight over it. And like I said, I can see both sides. I feel like if you borrow a lot of money, you should pay it back. At the same time, when you're 19 or 18 or 17 and they slide a piece of paper across the desk to you and you commit to $50,000 in debt for 1 year, I mean, you've literally mortgaged your future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. That a lot of people had no idea what they were committing to, and they were encouraged to, in effect, forget about those commitments because they kept postponing the payments. And during COVID, they were postponed. And then Biden has recently tried to get forgiveness. Now the Supreme Court is probably going to shoot that down, but the ruling on that's due probably in the next month or so. But yeah, there was a lot of encouragement, and I think people were basically, oh yeah, I'll take the money. I'm not going to worry about paying it back. And for years and years they didn't. So there was no real pressure.
Right. No, and then you get into a situation where people just genuinely can't pay it back. So
Yeah.
So what I want to try to do is give people who might be watching, who are perhaps in that situation, they're in the middle class, either they're about to go to college or they're a parent, help them figure out what path makes sense just from a purely economic perspective, because there's an argument out there, and my neighbors ask me about this all the time. There's an argument out there that if you get into a truly elite school, a Harvard, an Ivy, or a Stanford, MIT, that you should probably go, even if you come out with a pile of debt, because it's an admittance to a wealthy club, and it's going to propel your career. And I can understand that. And I'd love your thoughts on that. And then the next tier below, how do you start to decide what if you didn't get into Harvard?
You have to start out saying, what are your objectives? I mean, if your objective is purely to get a well-paying job, that's one thing. If you really want to educate your mind, if critical thinking, the current buzzword, if you will, if that's important to you, if you have natural curiosity, if you think life is worth more than just a paycheck and lots of money, that's a different situation. And I think that there is something to be said, and I'm reflecting a bias from my own education back many decades ago. But I think there is something to be said for the critical thinking. And actually, if you look at the people who've gotten to the tippy top in almost any business or pursuit, they tend to be liberal arts graduates. They tend to be people who had a broad thinking. The engineers of the world are very important. And hey, I was a physics major as an undergraduate, and I was very much involved in science. But those people are very important to the world. But if you're saying I really want to get to the top, you probably ought to go study Plato. If you just want to look at the statistics on that, so you need to make that decision. Then you're right. Do you want to get into a elite school? There's been a lot of Thomas Sowell. Do you know who he is? Thomas Sowell. He's at the at the Hoover Institute in Palo Alto, and he wrote a matter of fact. I quoted this in one of my reports. He wrote a story of a young who was intelligent, and he was picked out for big things. So he was schooled and coached and got into Harvard. And he just couldn't cut it. He just didn't have the mental capability, and he dropped out. And he ended up bagging groceries in a supermarket. And the moral of the story is, if he had gone to a less competitive school, where he wouldn't have been discouraged because he was just so far behind the most of the students there that he just gave up. If he'd been in a place that was more matched to his mental capability, he probably would have come out and done fairly well. So there's something to be said for matching your mental capability with the institution. If you're going to be completely lost and not even get through or just barely get through or flunk out, that's not a wise choice either. But I think people need to, what do you want in life? And if you want, when I was in school, I think a lot of the people, you didn't have STEM. STEM, that term didn't exist then. But most people who I think now are in that, they were going into medicine. That was a big attraction. It was a nice, safe birth, respectable, middle class occupation and a profession, and it was that kind of thing. It was the idea of a nice, safe birth and comfortable living and so on and so forth. And I think that's what STEM is today. But I maybe I'm getting a little too philosophical for this conversation, but I think people have to really sit down and say, what do I really want at the end of the day? If it's a nice, secure birth, and if you got the brains and the ability, STEM is certainly the hot area and probably will continue to be for at least a few years. But that may not be what everybody wants.
When I look back not too long ago to when my first child went to school, and you see the process, right? You visit a whole bunch of schools. They inevitably fall in love with one or two of them, and then the offers start coming, and you start to really look at the costs, and it's the difference. Inevitably, your child falls in love with the most expensive one, right? Right.
Because they had a great college tour on campus by a good
That's
guy.
exactly right.
Something that relevant. Yeah.
That's exactly right. The tour guide was having a good day, and it was sunny, and everyone was playing frisbee on the lawn, and that can swing it. But then when you sit down, and this is where I think it's hard for parents, because you just want to give your child what you had. If you, like, I went to school and had a fantastic time, and most of my lifelong friends came from that era.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to the University of Vermont, so not an elite school, good
UVM,
school, but not elite. But I didn't want to go there. I wanted to go to Syracuse. But my father said it pretty bluntly. Syracuse is going to cost 3 times as much. You're going to UVM. Oh, okay. And that, I think that is, with the prevalence of loans, that cold hard analysis is not as forced on people, and perhaps it should be. You can still get a great education and choose between the lower cost school. Obviously, you need to choose wisely, but that's a decision I think that people need to start really getting serious about.
There've been a lot of studies on this, as I'm sure you're aware, and they show that the institution is much less important than the motivation and interest of the students.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier, I mean, there is the idea of I graduated from Harvard, or I graduated from Amherst, or I got a PhD from Stanford, or hey, I'm not above whatever prestige goes with that kind of trappings. I'll take it. I'm not proud, but it really has limited value according to all the studies I've seen. It's really the motivation, the interest of the individual student that ultimately matter at the end of the day. Now, parents obviously want the very best they can get for their kids, and Varsity Blues showed this. I mean, they would go to very illegal, unethical means to promote their kids, even though it was just despicable. And you really wonder, how could some of those parents face their kids, or did their kids even know that they were being crooked? But in any event, people do want the best for their kids, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the best for the child, and it may not be what the child really wants to do. I mean, there's all kinds of stories of parents who, in effect, promoted particular colleges, alma mater in particular, children. It was a complete misfit. They had no interest in there. They wanted to be ballet dancers, and the old man said, "No, you're going to be an engineer." And I mean, the world is replete with those kinds of stories. We all know that. So it's. But then then you say, "Hey, here's a kid of 17, 18. Do they really know enough to know how they can lay out their career path from there?" But I think there's something to be said to starting off with a fairly general education and take a year or two to really decide, what do you like? What are you good at? I think most of the things we like in life are things we're good at. If you like tennis, if you're a good tennis player, end of story. But I think there's something to be for a general education to start, and not to get so specialized that you really can't escape. I mean, a brother. I come from a medical family. My dad was a dentist. There were 6 kids in his family, 5 boys, 1 girl. The boys are all MDs or dentists. The girl married a dentist. Okay, my brother started out in dentistry. My dad was trying to convince him he ought to go into medicine instead. So he spent a year in dental school, the University of Michigan, and then switched to medicine. Well, they lost a year. Well, he did that because he thought he had to follow in Dad's footsteps, and Dad was telling him, "No, you ought to go into medicine," and that's where he ended up. But it was a case of not really following what he instinctively was good at to begin with.
Sure, and I think I agree with you. I think that if young people can get a general education, it helps them approach problems better. It helps them see other viewpoints, helps them become better employees or business creators or contributors to the economy. But when they come out with $100,000, $200,000 in debt, it actually is a huge drag. It can be a huge drag on the economy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That issue is clearly unresolved, and the debt's accumulated. They mentioned colleges could raise costs indefinitely. Those who really couldn't afford it, a lot of them are exactly what you're talking about. They went very heavily into debt. But I think a lot of them didn't really think they owed that money. They just, okay, where do I sign? I'm not sure they thought ahead and said, now, wait a minute, what am I going to have to give up in the future to service that debt? If I'm going to have to pay, $5,000, $10,000 a year out of a starting income of, whatever it's 40, 50,000, if I'm going to have that much discretionary money that I can afford that and still live a decent life, I would be willing to bet that very few people went through that mental exercise or put it down on paper. So I think there was a just a complete. Well, you remember in the book and movie Gone with the Wind, Scarlett O'Hara, every time she got into trouble, you know what she always said? "I'll think about that tomorrow." Remember that line? "I'll think about that tomorrow." Yes. Okay, that's the attitude. I'll think about that tomorrow. But I think right now, I don't know what's going to happen to the student debt issue. I mean, obviously, it's the can is the proverbial can that's being kicked down the road, and it looks like it's going to ultimately take some action by Congress. Biden was trying to do it with administrative orders, but that doesn't look like the Supreme Court's going to go along with that. So it's going to take something. But I think a lot of it's a very contentious issue because the people who do have the huge debts, they obviously want to get out from under. But how about the people who service their debts? Some of them have made good on their commitments, and how do they feel? I was a sucker. I was a sucker. I paid up. I was honest. Uh, it's a very thorny issue. I honestly don't know how it's going to end up, but I would hope that it would be an example, and people going forward would be a lot more careful about incurring those huge debts, and would go to less expensive schools. That colleges would be a lot more careful on the expenditures. That you would have the system changed so that people would not end up with those debts or the temptation to take on those debts.
That was my hope with this conversation, is to help people see that that's what needs to happen. Setting aside that sticky issue of the existing debt, if we could save some people from getting into it, that's a good outcome. Gary, nobody can speak with you without asking how you're feeling about the markets in general, and how to invest these days. So if you wouldn't mind, could we take 3 minutes at the end of this conversation just to kind of get your thoughts on bonds and the stock market and just how you're feeling about the economy right now?
Well, of course, whether we're in or close to a recession, we're going to have one is a sort of changes daily, and the weather vane really shifts back and forth on that. Whatever you call it, the economy is slowing. Consumers, their consumers' incomes in inflation adjusted terms are declining. Their spending in inflation adjusted terms is declining. You look at a lot of the indicators, leading indicators, measures of the economy. They say the economy is weak, and probably in or close to recession. We haven't seen that reflected completely in stocks. I looked on stocks, and this goes back to early last year, and I said I thought we were going to see a sort of a two-part decline in stocks. The first part was because of the Fed raising rates, which they did, and they're still in that process, but getting near the end. The second half was a weakness in sales and profits, and that's what I think we're getting into, and I think that'll be the second half. So I don't think that the bear market, and you can define the bear markets any way you want to, but I don't think that process is completed. As far as interest rates, and as you know, I probably my greatest call was in the early 80s. I said we're entering the bond rally of a lifetime, and the yield on the 30-year bond was 14.6%. It got down below 3%. Treasuries outperformed the S&P 500 by 5.5 times since the early 80s. So is this bond rally of a lifetime over? It certainly got curtailed. We saw last year when the Fed started raising rates. But interestingly enough, since October, long-term Treasury bonds have been rallying. Now, why is that? I think there are three reasons. One is weak economy. It's a safe haven. That's where people want to be, both domestic and international investors. Secondly, when you get into a weak economy, there's less credit demand for high quality credit. Now, the junk, you never could get enough because the junk companies need more, but they're going out of business. Doesn't matter. They're a different category. And the third thing, eventually the Fed is going to ease. Now, I think the Fed is going to be more slower to ease than usual. If you look in the last 4 business cycles, and you look at the federal funds rate, which is the Fed's policy instrument, it has actually declined before the peak in business is defined by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And that they're the guys that call the shot, nonprofit organization, NBER. No administration ever want to be in the business of calling recessions. Oh, no. That's a political third rail. Okay. But if you look at the history as recorded, the Fed has eased in the last 4 cycles before the recorded peak in business. I think it's going to be later this time. Why? Because they want to make sure inflation is dead. If you go back, Powell and start out behind the 8 ball. First of all, his 3 predecessors, Bernanke, and then Greenspan, and then Bernanke, and then Yellen. You have the Greenspan put, the Bernanke put, the Yellen put. In other words, the idea that Wall Street felt they could unload their problems on the Fed. And so he came in with the expectation there was going to be a Powell foot. The second problem we had is that the Fed did not realize the extent of inflation early last year. They thought it was a temporary supply chain disruptions and reopening frictions in the economy, and so inflation got a hand. And they actually did not start raising rates until inflation actually peaked out at 9% in the middle of the year. So they were behind the curve. I think they've now basically said, we're going to kill inflation. And they've been in the process of convincing the investors, particularly equity investors, that they are serious. And I think they're going to stick to their guns longer than normal. That's what I'm really coming to. I think they want to kill inflation. They want to kill it dead. We just got the CPI report today, the year over year on the core, ex-food and energy, 4%. That's where it's been in the most of the last 6 months, I think. And that is the Fed's concern. That's not the 2% they want. And they're particularly worried about service inflation because goods, the big buying spree of goods when everybody was home with the pandemic, that's over. The inventories are caught up and so on. But it's the services, and the service inflation is just not budging. So I think the Fed is going to. I think they're going to stick to it. So I don't see the Fed easing till probably the end of this year, maybe even into next year.
Do you think that what finally gets them to ease is inflation dropping below 2% for a period, or is it more? Do you think it'll be more tied to employment, or more specifically, an increase?
Yeah, well,
in
employment is always a lagging series, and that's the second thing that's lagging this time. The one I just described is the Fed wanting to make sure inflation is dead. The other one is employment. You look at employers; they spend so much time and energy hiring people that now sales are weak, profits are weak. It takes time and mindset shift to shift 180 degrees from hiring to firing. So they're slower than usual in firing people, but they will. That's what happens in periods of weakness. So I think that too is going to stretch things out. But the Fed would want to see that. They want to see unemployment go up. They don't say so, but they want to. They want to see evidence that, let's say, inflation is low and staying low, and they want to see evidence that the economy is cooled off. Now, they're not deliberately out to precipitate a recession, but they basically said that if we get one, it's pretty much in line with what they need to do.
Gary, I could talk to you all day. I really appreciate you taking some time. Gary Shilling, always good to see you.
Good conversation. I appreciate the opportunity.